Life Audio.
Hello, and welcome to the Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic podcast. I am your host, John Seidel. This is your home for real stories, radical vulnerability, and remarkable comebacks. In the end, this podcast is a place for the desperate, the downtrodden, the destitute, and especially the drunk. But it's also a place of hope and healing. I know that firsthand because I'm the Christian who became an alcoholic, not the other way around. Today, I've found sobriety after decades of struggling. But more importantly than finding sobriety, I found Jesus. My prayer is that as I interview people just like you and just like me, along with professionals in the fields of trauma, faith, and addiction recovery, you will find the peace that is available to you through Christ on the other side of whatever you're going through and whatever addiction that might be. Because let's face it, we're all addicted to something. So welcome. Let's get radically vulnerable as we explore what it looks like to be on this journey of messy sanctification. We'll be right back after this. You know, if you really think about it, at the core, at the beginning of time, we have been asking questions. Like you think back to the garden and there was the question that the serpent asked of Eve, you know, when he's trying to get her to eat the apple. But then there are these other questions after that God asks Adam and Eve after they eat the fruit that are just really key to understanding life, addiction, and recovery. Now, that's not me saying that. That's not me coming up with this novel new idea. That comes from someone I really respect. He is a therapist named Chuck DeGroat, a Christian therapist. He's written several books. One of them is about narcissism that a lot of people have read when narcissism comes to church. But his most recent book is called Healing What's Within, and it is, you know, what I would say is one of the best books on integrating faith and recovery and psychology, and just all the things that I think we need to understand ourselves better and understand how God is the answer to our ultimate deep brokenness. Chuck is my guest today on the podcast, and those two questions especially that he's going to hone in on are the ones that God asks, where he says, where are you and who told you? And it's something that Chuck then calls homing. Now, if you remember, we had a conversation about our union with Christ and that doctrine with Kyle Worley on a previous episode. You can go back and listen to that. And I think Chuck takes this even further into the realm of addiction recovery. And so, you know, really what that homing is, it's the Spirit drawing us back to worth and belonging and purpose in Him. And this is going to be a beautiful, beautiful episode. We'll also talk about what Chuck calls vulnerability. Vulnerability, right? If you know me, I love radical vulnerability. And Chuck has this term that he calls vulnerability, which is fake vulnerability. And so we're going to talk about that as well as how we, those of us who have gone through trauma, need an empathetic witness, and how the parts work that we do can honor the protector, the firefighter that's trying to, in a sense, maybe stamp out some of that stuff, while also not letting that person drive the bus. This is a great and powerful conversation that I'm excited for you to hear. Chuck is really just a great guy. Before we get that, though, man, I'm coming to you this week and I'm just blown away. Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic has become the number one top new release in alcoholism recovery. That's not just my wife was pointing this out to me yesterday. She's like, honey, that's not like the Christian category. That's in all of alcoholism recovery. And I was like, man, thank you, Lord. Again, not because of me, but because of the message that is getting out there. So listen, if you have not bought the book yet, and I know we have thousands upon thousands of listeners here, would you please buy it? And even if you don't think you can benefit from it, which you can, newsflash, there will be someone in your life that I think can. And by buying and purchasing the book on Amazon, you can go to bakerbookhouse.com. You can really just go to christianalcoholic.com and find all the ways to buy it. You are helping now the book climb the charts, which then gets it in front of people. So people who are looking for alcoholism recovery, people who are looking for answers on Amazon are now going to be able to see my book and the message of hope that Jesus offers. So please go to christianalcoholic.com and purchase the book. All right. So without further ado, let's get this conversation started with Chuck DeGroat. Chuck, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a real treat. You know, I was telling you before we hopped on that I was going through all my notes and getting all my questions ready, and I like have this huge list in my Evernote notebook, and then I realized I'm only on chapter 2 going through all my notes. So I just really this book is such a blessing. It's such a deep, rich resource, and so thank you for writing it and for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks, John.
So I just kind of want to jump right in because, like I said, there's so much that we can talk about. But you know, the book is called Healing What's Within. Can you kind of give us a quick, I know that may be hard, but overview when you talk about healing what's within? What I love about the book is you don't shy away from the fact that you had healing to do, right? And so when it comes to that healing journey, how did you realize you needed to heal what's within?
Boy, yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's come in waves over the years, oftentimes around painful experiences, failures, disappointments, misunderstandings, betrayals, things like that, right? I think the biggest one, and the one that I point to, I think a couple of different times in the book, was a hospitalization back in 2012, where people know the name of the book, The Body Keeps the Score. My body kept the score. And I landed in a Mexican hospital while on vacation. That's quite a story. And that was really an awakening to me that my body was not in good shape at 42 years old. And so that really set me on a journey over the next the 10 years after that of a different kind of healing that was more of an embodied kind of healing, a reconnection with myself. And so, you know, in the book, I talk a lot about the problem of disconnection from ourselves, from our own bodies, from our own emotions and intuitions. And so that was really a journey of reconnection to God, to myself, and to others.
So on that front, you talk about this disconnection, and you really frame the book in light of some of these main questions, and you use the garden narrative in Genesis, you know, to talk about that. Introduce those big questions, and especially with using the garden narrative that helped you and that can help us heal.
Yeah, those were questions, at least the first question that I've been using for quite a number of years. I just don't think that I did deep enough work with them over the years, but the questions come from Genesis 3, and they're really familiar to readers, to most readers, although few of us think of these questions as directed to us. That first question that God asks, where are you? The question for Adam and Eve in the midst of their shame, their hiding, their self-protection, meets us in the midst of our own shame and hiding and self-protection, and really asks us to pay attention to what's going on right here and right now. I use this, as you know, I call it the dashboard, our thoughts, our emotions, our body, our behaviors, our relationships, in order to get an assessment of the yellow lights and the red lights of our lives, you know, the places where we might sense a little bit of caution and maybe to some extent some worry about what might be happening at greater depth. The second question, who told you? which gets at our stories, that invites us to listen more deeply to the voices in our lives that have power in our lives, the narratives, the stories from our past that continue to be restoried in our lives. And then the final question that God asks, have you eaten from the tree? That's the one that I had to wrestle with a bit.
Mm,
Uh, and I think this is one that really gets at the nature of addiction to some extent. But as I listened to that question, what I heard was, where have you taken your hunger and thirst?
mm.
And I think that's a deep one. That's another one that we continue to ask, especially as, well, today our attention is so divided. We're all at some level dopamine addicts, going from one thing to the other to the other. Where have you taken your hunger and thirst?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think you talk about how you were, that hunger and thirst, you were bringing it elsewhere. What has that been for you?
That really has been a lifelong unfolding process of discovering um, all the different places that my heart goes. My early spiritual director was a man named Gerald May. Gerald May was at the Shalem Institute in Washington, D.C., and he wrote a book called Addiction and Grace. And it was the first book for me that really opened my eyes to how broad addiction is, how deep it is. Like, I wanted to think that maybe addiction applied to one area of my life or one behavior. And, and he really expanded that conversation for me and allowed me to see how fickle my heart is, how hungry my heart is. Um, and so I think that it's been a lifelong wrestling for me. And at the same time, there are moments, as I mentioned just a bit ago, um, where we have to come to grips with the way addiction works. I think in San Francisco, when I ended up being hospitalized, I think one of the things I realized was that um, although I was engaged in some really good things, we'd started a missional training center out there for church planners. I was getting to lead spiritual retreats. All of it looked really good. But there was a kind of workaholism
Mm.
involved with that could be blessed. A lot of people say, "Oh, that's really good. I'm so proud of you. God is doing such great things." Those are the kinds of addictions that we don't often see or name, especially in Christian spaces. We look at the ones that we've got ones that we target as
Yeah.
especially bad, sex addiction and other things. But what about our religious workaholism? Can we talk about those kinds of things?
So this brings up an interesting question, and I I don't know fully the answer. This is why I'm
Mm.
asking it. How do you then explain how we can be doing something, using something, and and it can be workaholism for us, but yet God still seems to be blessing
Yeah.
that work.
Yeah.
Like how does that happen? How can that happen?
I mean, that's happening all the time. That's happening right now,
Right.
because it's a myth that somehow, some way, we find our way to some sort of purity, in our
Mm,
conversation, in our speech, in our action, in our behavior. Um, and so it's an invitation for us always to see the ways in which we're hiding, we're self-protecting. It goes back to that Genesis 3 story. Where are you? It's an invitation to me this morning as I'm driving in, curious about some of the conversations that I've had with my wife lately, some of the things that are going on, some of the stresses, and how and where that leaves me. It's an invitation after our time together to ask questions about where I am, how I showed up, my authenticity, my presence, my honesty, right? Because I think for a lot of us, our ways of coping, our masks become the only face that we know to some
mm,
degree. So I'm always asking, am I connected, or how am I showing up? And those are questions that we asked, throughout the course of our lives.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I love that you say it's a myth, right? Because I think one of the things that I talk about in Confessions is that, like, we know that God uses sinners because He's using us. Because
Mhm.
like anyone that He uses is a
Yeah.
sinner, and I think we forget that. right?
Yeah.
Like we forget, and we kind of then expect our own lives to be, well, I got to be perfect, right?
Yeah.
Or whatnot. So I love that you call it a myth. I want to take a detour for just a second. You, I think,
Sure.
obviously you've been doing great work for a long time, but really a lot of people were exposed to you about 5 years ago when you wrote a book, When Narcissism Comes to Church.
Mhm.
And that book exploded, and in I think for all the good reasons. And as we cross the 5-year anniversary of that, I want to ask you about the importance of repentance.
Yeah.
I think we've seen a lot of church leaders fall, and we have seen some of them be repentant, and yet I think we've seen plenty of them not. And
Mhm.
in Confessions, I talk about, repentance is key. And I would be lying if when I wrote that section in the book, I wasn't thinking about some of these church leaders who weren't repentant
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
kind of mourning it. And so what actually does repentance look like? And especially when dealing with people who have messed up, whether they're alcoholics like me or whether
Yeah.
they're narcissists.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I certainly think, as I've worked with alcoholics over the years, who have gone through the 12 steps, there's a process there that invites you to do really deep and specific work, right? That fearless moral inventory
Yeah.
that everyone who works the steps has to do, right? That's painful. It's a lot easier to keep our repentance, our confession generic or broad. I know I've sinned. I know I've screwed up. I know I've hurt people. Uh, that leads to what Dietrich Bonhoeffer calls a cheap grace.
Yes.
Costly grace, right, is specific. It's intentional. It's personal. It's reparative in the sense that it looks at the ways in which you've hurt, harmed, wounded, and makes reparation specifically around those kinds of things. And so, as I engage people who long to be repentant, that's often for me the intersection. Like some will go in the direction of like, that's just too much. Like I want to repent, bro. I want to write a letter to my congregation and say, I did some hurtful things. The intersection for me is, are you willing to take that more narrow road, as some say, right? That road of engaging specifically the ways in which you harmed, and doing that in ways that are personal and account for the particularities of harm, that do the kind of repair work that repair around reputation or financial loss or other things that come into play when we're doing real repentance, right? So that's what I'd say.
We'll be right back after this. How can we know? I think my wife, it was pretty clear when I was repentant, right? To your point,
Right.
I was specific. I was like not defensive for the first time in, years and years.
Yeah.
How can we know when maybe someone who is in the public eye, who has fallen or who has
Yeah.
engaged in some of that? How can we know if and when they are repentant? Because sometimes we're not privy to those
Yeah.
conversations that are going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. I don't know that we can know. I think the people who've been harmed might be in the best position to name what they've experienced, right? I think Judith Herman's most recent book talks a lot about this. We've really got to center the person who was harmed and allow them to name that reality. And so, in situations where I've worked, that I've worked within, there have been moments or times where someone who's harmed the church, a spiritual abuser, a narcissistic pastor, has done work over the course of a year or two, where as I check in with those who are harmed, they'll say, yeah, this actually, it's been real. It felt very specific. There have been particular ways in which he's gone back to other people who, he said terrible things to me about, and has made those relationships right. They'll name those specific things, and they'll say, I'm not completely sure I can still trust him or that I'd ever be in relationship with him, but I feel like he's done some work toward reparation, if not restoration.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's really good. Thank you. And
Yeah.
that kind of brings up another aspect of when narcissism comes to church that I'd like to ask you about. And
Yeah.
it goes really well with I think this aspect of confessions, which is uh, you and I both know that vulnerability, Brene Brown has done so much great work around that term, and it's been in vogue. And yet I think that so many people have learned how to hide behind
Mm.
regular vulnerability, right? And
Yeah.
so I call for people to do radical vulnerability. And then I read something you wrote, and
Mm.
you came up with this term that I absolutely love
Mm.
called vulnerability, right?
Right.
FAUX. And
Yeah.
so I would love for you to talk about vulnerability versus
Yeah.
vulnerability and why we need the former.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, of course, vulnerability is far more costly, right? In the root of the word gets at the capacity to be wounded. Like it's going to be hard. It's going to cost something as we lean in with vulnerability. In the case of vulnerability, you're just trying to smooth things over. You're just trying to image manage.
Yeah.
But it looks enough like humility or vulnerability that some are fooled. And this could be the pastor that gets in front of the church and makes a, like we were just talking about a moment ago, broad confession. Some will say to themselves, "Well, wow, he seems so humble. He even had a tear in his eye." Or the letter that you get, "I know I've hurt some of you. I'm so sorry. I want to be a better leader, pastor, friend, husband, partner." Right, and so I think to some degree it's on a spectrum, because I think as we grow in our own capacity to reckon with the harm that we've caused, to reckon with our own pain itself and trauma, we I think we grow in our capacity to be more vulnerable. And as we become more vulnerable, we're just not as apt to try to protect and preserve a particular narrative about ourselves. I think every addict, right, who begins with the first step understands that basic powerlessness. I'm not in control. I can't, like, let me just give up control.
Yeah.
I couldn't, it was a myth anyway, right? I couldn't control the narrative. And so, but there's always that sense with vulnerability that, but maybe I can, or maybe I can have my cake and eat it too. Maybe I could look kind of powerless and out of control and repentant and messy, and at the same time use that for people to say, well, look at him. Well, this is going to be a great comeback story now. And we're seeing that with a number of pastors nowadays, right?
Yeah.
Where the narrative, it's sort of like a misuse of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, right? Like where there's this epic return from a massive fall, and but even that is a part of the work of image management.
Yeah. Right. So how do you practice? How do you go from vulnerability to true vulnerability?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I obviously don't know your story, so I'd be curious to hear from you what that's looked like. But I do think um, that it's, as I often say, because I work with lots of pastors, leaders, CEOs, things like that, that it can't be done in public, that it's
Mm,
got to be done in private, which is to say, in the depths of your own being, honest before God, but also in the sacredness of a few really intimate relationships, close relationships, vulnerable relationships, a couple good friends, a therapist, people who know you, people who are willing to give you the kind of feedback that you need to get. I'm not talking about your boys,
yeah.
the people who will reflect back to you what you want to hear. Man, you're doing it, dude. You're so, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the people who say, yeah, you hurt me, you harmed me, or I'm not, let's not play that game today. I'll say that as a therapist sometimes, like, can we just not play that game today? And so I think that's where it begins. But what we know about this work is that it takes a lot of time. for us to become comfortable with ourselves. I mean, the very nature of narcissism and the abuse that comes in and through it, it's like addiction. The very nature of it is disconnection. And so for someone to move back toward connection, and the vulnerability that comes with that, well, that takes some time, and really it requires our brains to be retrained toward authenticity, toward honesty, toward transparency, toward vulnerability, rather than the mask that we've worn.
So you said something in there that I think is a great segue. You talked about disconnection,
Right.
and in the book, you talk about, like, part of me. My wife told me after a really nice rock bottom moment on South Beach in Miami.
Wow.
John, I don't want you to promise me to stop drinking. I want you to promise me to get to the root
Yeah, that's good.
of why you're drinking, because she's like, otherwise it's just gonna be something else. And I was kind of like, can we just go to the part where I promise not to drink? Because I knew there were some traumas down deep, and I had talked about them a little bit, but I'd never really done the work.
Yeah.
And so you talk about how the heart of trauma is disconnection.
Right.
And what has been so interesting to me is, I'm sure you're familiar with Johann Hari and his talk on addiction,
Yes, okay.
and how the opposite of addiction is connection.
I think I quote that too somewhere.
You
I
might.
don't know where.
Yeah.
It's so good. Yeah, that's it. You're absolutely right.
So my question to you on that idea and that concept is, what really is so diabolical about disconnection that it's at the heart of our traumas and our addictions?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I love Gabor Mate's line, the addiction isn't the problem, it's the attempted solution to the problem, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's it, right? So let's not demonize our addictions. Let's get curious about our addictions, right? And recognize that we're all swimming in a sea of addiction, right? The possibilities are endless, and so we can very quickly move from one to another. I think as we get down lower to the roots of the addiction, as your wife, beautiful, by the way, how courageous of her. We get down to we get to places in our own lives, our own stories, where we experience some sense of disconnection, which is to say self-alienation, self-estrangement. And that often begins in our earliest years, where our authenticity was squelched in one way or another. You're supposed to look like this or be like that, or the Smiths, or whatever your last name might be, are men who become lawyers or pastors or doctors, or we all have stories like this. We get down to the stories of abuse or neglect. And so that's what we need to become curious about. That's why that second question is so important. Who told you? What are the voices? How do those voices continue to live in your life? And so for me, over the years, there's been this sense that that sense of self-alienation or self-estrangement goes way, way back. And it's really hard. It's not a flip of a switch, as you know, right? It's not a snap of a finger and I'm authentic now. I'm present. I'm connected.
Right.
A connection is actually really costly. I mean, it can fundamentally change the nature of your relationships as you begin to live in a new connected way, because you realize, what disconnection manifested in wasn't just that addiction, was all the varied masks that you've been wearing or parts that you've been playing in your life.
I appreciate you saying even that concept of, like, we are all addicts, right? And I think some people are like, "Whoa, what?" And it's like, getting to the heart of why. I love the Marte quote as well. And so that kind of brings me to this aspect is I've heard Kurt Thompson talk about this as well, and Kurt's going to come on the podcast. But you talk about these four core things that we all want as
Mhm.
children.
Yeah.
And I know it's not original to you, and I think Dan Siegel might have come up
It
with it, but
Mhm.
it's this need to feel safe, seen, soothed, and
Yeah.
secure.
Yeah.
Can you talk about those four things and why they are at the heart of so many, whether it's addictions or
Yeah.
narcissism or whatever?
Yeah, these are the core relational needs, the core human needs, right? And, you might say that they were articulated by, Dan Siegel, right? Who's a psychiatrist and attachment psychologist. But this goes back to Genesis 1 and 2, that we're
Mm.
created in and for relationship, right? And so this basic idea that we're created to be known, seen, heard, loved, bonded to, attached to, right? I love that it's so succinct in Dan Siegel's language of safe, seen, soothed, and secure, which is to say, as I often say, that we're created in the image of God, who created us for at least three things, maybe more, but for worth, for belonging, and for purpose.
Mm.
Those are core. I was a biblical studies guy back in the day, so I've got a lot of old research behind that, but that sense that we're designed for dignity, that there's a deep sense of delight. We need that from our parents, our earliest caregivers, that we're created for belonging, which is to say we're created to be known and loved, to be held. I whispered over my daughters, "I love you," as I was rocking them in their first weeks, right? "I love you. I'll always be here for you." We hear that refrain over and over in scripture too. And for purpose, which is to say, you matter. Your life matters. This is where, again, Gabor Mate talks about not just the value of attachment, but authenticity, that we need people in our lives to champion our uniqueness, not just to say, you got to do what your dad did, or this is the way we do it, or this is the way the church does it, but to see that, there's a really interesting thing. Chuck is 2, 3 years old, and he likes to build. I'm just making this up right now, but like he likes to build things with his hands, right? Okay, so how does a parent notice that? Or he likes to draw, or look at him. He's always just sitting out observing the birds or whatever it is, that we notice these markers of our uniqueness, our authenticity. And so what I find in my work, and I've been a therapist now for 25 plus years, is that those core needs, people will come to me and they'll say, my parents were great. But when we get down to those four core needs and that image bearing sense of worth and belonging and purpose, lots of folks will say to me, yeah, yeah, my parents were great. All of us are imperfect, right? As parents, but I didn't really feel like I mattered. I felt like there was a wonderful plan that they had for my lives. Or I just, I sort of got lost. There were four siblings, and sort of got lost in the mix. And I never felt like I was uniquely loved. So this can look different in all of us. And that's where we attend to our particular wounds.
So you bring up a really, what I think is a tough aspect of this conversation. And it's a tough aspect that I've had with my family, because when I look back at those four things, I think a lot of issues stem from where I didn't feel seen.
Mhm.
And yet having that conversation with my family, especially my mom, I'll be honest. She's like, "Well, what do you like? I did, I was trying, like,
Yeah, I did the best I can.
yeah, right."
Yeah.
And she
Yeah.
was, and my dad left in the middle of the night. My mom was all of a sudden a single mom,
Yeah.
four kids. Like, I get that.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
how do you reconcile, or how do you even have that conversation between, I didn't feel seen,
Yeah.
and I can say I didn't feel, even though
Yeah.
my mom was she had no indication that I
Yeah.
was not being seen.
Yeah.
How do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, so that just is, right? I mean, if we're honest, the reality is we're born into a broken world and broken relationships, and we don't get it right. My daughters now are 24 and 22 years old. We've had a number of conversations about my lack of connection or presence, my distraction or my anger or my whatever it might be, right? And so I like how Dan Siegel, by the way, says you got to get it right 50% of the time. I don't know why he says 50% of the time, but I can work with that.
Yeah, right.
Um, although I don't know that I quite got up to 50% of the time, right? But we talked about repentance earlier. This is where we live in this
Mm,
beautiful sort of matrix of confession and repentance and repair, that every relationship is going to have this dynamic of rupture and repair. It's inevitable. I think now the question uh, that all of us have as we wrestle with our parents, I did too many, many years ago, is like, how do we have those hard conversations?
yeah.
What does it look like to say to mom or dad, I didn't feel seen in the ways that I needed to feel seen. And I think those are really nuanced. Like every single person I sit with, that conversation has to look unique, and
Mm,
there are ways of entering into that conversation that are more or less helpful. I was originally invited to simply confront my parents, like head on, to say, "You failed me," and that was, I think, probably therapeutic malpractice.
mm.
That was not helpful. That only led to more rupture. I needed to find maybe another way of going in. That said, my mom in particular ended up doing some really good work, and we ended up repairing in really significant ways.
Real quickly, do you have a tip on how to enter in that conversation then? Like, is there, instead of just going and confronting it,
Yeah.
what is one way to do that well?
Well, this is where it's hard to generalize, right?
Mm,
Because what if your parent was abusive?
right.
um, and you're just used to being gaslit. The chances are you're not gonna find a parent who's willing to enter in with you,
Yeah.
and you can be re-traumatized. So in some cases, you can't enter into that conversation. But I often think, you know, entering through the back door. Jesus modeled this for us, right? He told it slant, right? He told stories. Um, I think that there are indirect ways. I think that there are not passive ways, but ways that are not as in your face, not as confrontational, that I think a lot of my clients find helpful. But if you go in expecting that there's going to be this sort of moment of this Disney moment of catharsis and
Yeah.
repair, uh, it usually doesn't happen that way, right? There's a first conversation. So my advice would be to say, what would the first conversation look like?
Mm,
Like what one piece would you want to offer? Hey, Dad, for me, when I was young and you didn't show up to band concerts and sporting events and stuff like that, it was just hard. I looked out there to see your face and I didn't see your face and I felt missed. What was going on back then? I'm just curious, start a conversation if it feels safe enough to, but in some
yeah.
cases it's not.
You've brought up that's good. Thank you. You've brought up a word a couple times in the last few minutes that I think is really important, and it was revolutionary for me as I, going back to repentance and who are you confided in. I tell people I didn't do AA, but I paid an AA sponsor $150 every week for a year, and that was
Yeah.
my therapist.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that she taught me comes down to one word: curiosity.
Yeah.
And boy, has that changed my life.
Yeah.
What is so important about curiosity when you're looking to, as we say, do the work
Yeah.
of healing what's within?
So I love something called internal family systems. This modality,
Yes.
Richard Schwartz. He's got 8 C's. I can't remember all the 8 C's off the top of my head ever, and I've been working with it for a long time. Compassion, creativity, courage, curiosity is one of them.
Yes.
I think curiosity is a body, a soul in a state of connection. I mean, we can become curious when we're in a state of self connection, and so it takes some work to get there, particularly if you've lived in disconnection. I think every addict that I've worked with, and well, by the way, that's everyone,
Yeah.
but anyone sort of stuck in their addiction, which is to say, stuck in that cycle of disconnection, uh, finds curiosity kind of hard, because what they know is, what they do daily, that daily pharmacy that they go to, whether it's Netflix or video games or drugs or alcohol, whatever it is, that's what works for them. Um, but curiosity comes from a connected heart. And there's a self curiosity that comes out of that. We're able to sort of look at our own ourselves with greater honesty,
Mm.
our own stories with greater honesty. Yeah, wow, I don't show up well, or I'm constantly maneuvering or manipulating people that I'm around. It shows up internally and in relationships.
So I'm so glad you brought up parts work.
Yeah.
So I started with EMDR therapy to really, root out the junk, and then switched to parts work. And we've had Dr. Allison Cook on to talk about parts work. Just, I highly encourage it. But I will say this. One of the hardest things that I've had to come to grips with as a Christian who became an alcoholic, not the other way around, is there were moments, there were times where, I wrote a book on faith and mental health, and that I'm still getting emails about how that's helpful. And yet in the wake of that book coming out, that's when I became an alcoholic. And so I think one of the ways I've been able to reconcile that is to say, there's a part of me that's an alcoholic,
Yeah,
right?
that's
There's
right.
there's that unhealed part.
Yes.
And so I want to, and so this is helpful that you say yes to this, because I kind of want to pose that to you for people that are listening to this.
Yeah.
Explain how there can be those unhealed parts of us that do the things we don't want to do, like Paul says, and that doesn't have to be the whole of us.
Yeah. It's a really important point, and so incredibly helpful when people hear that you are not an alcoholic. You are not an addict to your core, right?
Right.
I say this also when it comes to diagnoses. People come in and say, well, my psychiatrist diagnosed me with major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder. That must be who I am at some level.
Mm-hmm.
I am my addiction. I am my disorder. That's not the case. You are the image of God. You are created for worth, belonging, and purpose. You are your core self, even though you might not feel connected to it, is created for compassion, vulnerability, safety, goodness, flourishing. Parts of you have had to survive in a broken world, a Genesis 3 world, what I call the 1,185 chapters before Genesis 1 and 2 and Revelation 21 and 22. And in that 1,185 chapters, well, there are all kinds of ways in which we cope. And there are parts of us that become more activated, fixated, right, in particular kinds of ways. It might just be that for me, the kind of the lead part was a workaholic during those critical years before I landed in the hospital. Why? Because I was running away from some significant pain that I experienced in my own story of spiritual abuse within the church. There's a lot going on within, but that lead guy, that character in my inner drama, that workaholic part of me, he learned that, wow, people, churches, other pastors, like you like this, they like the part of you that's productive and successful and witty and smart and all the things, and so as I sat in the hospital, that workaholic part and I, we had a conversation, and I said, thank you for working so hard for me, and now it's time for you to relax, to step back. I don't want to lose you. I just don't want you to drive the bus anymore. You could sit a few seats behind me on the bus, but I want to drive the bus from my core, me, courageous me, compassionate me, connected me.
Yeah, I think for me, that was the escapism me, right? That was the part that became an alcoholic, right? The part that said, John, from all the traumas growing up with my sister and, sexual assault and, all the stuff was John, we need to get you away from this. We need to get you away from this.
Yeah.
And so initially was a very good thing, right? Get me away from this. Get me out of this situation.
Yeah.
And then that part took over. So when it was anxiety at work, when it was anxiety with my wife, we need to pull the ripcord. We need to get away. We need to get away.
That's right.
And you said something there that I think, like, initially when I did IFS work, I was like, I'm talking to myself, like I'm talking to these, like, this is so weird,
Yeah.
But I could say it is really healthy. And I just wanted to, I put this quote down, and you had talked about in this part of the book, but it says, your depression, your anxiety, even your addiction is not core to who you are, which you said. Instead, each of these realities within you needs the balm of reconnection.
Yeah, that's right.
Needs a witness to its pain. And I just think that is so beautiful.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing. I mean, I think we often talk about this in terms of the nervous system. You had a flight part, an escape part, eject part, but it wasn't the only part of you at work during that time.
Yes.
I mean, you had written a book, right?
Right.
So I'm sure you had very functional parts of you that could show up at work and be productive. And so we are multiple. Doesn't mean that you have multiple personality disorder, DID is what we call it. It does mean that there are different parts that show up in different ways in our life and in our world. And part of the work is understanding that fragmentation and becoming more whole. And so when we talk about wholeness, we're talking about living from that place of true self, to use language from the Christian tradition, to live from our core, recognizing that there are still parts of me, as there are parts of you, I'm sure, that remember well those detours that I took in the past. But as they relax, I think that these parts of us can be wonderful resources for us to point us to the goodness, the gifts of. I mean, there are parts of me that I think that would back in the day be, let's just say, would hide behind intellect. And I want to say, you don't have to drive the bus anymore, but certainly I'm really grateful for the ways in which you help me to, show up well, to preach good sermons, to write good books, etc. Right? So we bless these parts of ourselves.
We'll be right back after this. Yeah, it's so important. And I will say this, right? I love what you talk about, identity, and I have a whole chapter in my book about identity. And part of the reason I didn't do AA was just because there was a part of me that didn't feel comfortable with saying for the rest of my life, I'm John, an alcoholic. Now I realize I don't have to.
Yeah.
And then some people are like, the title of your book is Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic. And yet I go through and explain, here's why I use the term. I don't have to, and I can stop using it at any time. And in some situations, it's a very helpful term to use because people understand. And Confessions of a Christian with Alcohol Use Disorder is a really crappy title. But I want to come back to at the end of that quote that I read. You said, within you needs the balm of reconnection, needs a witness to its pain. And you've talked about Gabor Mate a couple times here, who I think is great. And you have this other Mate quote that says this, and I used it in my book as well. It says, trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness.
Right.
And can you unpack what that means? What does that mean, that it's not what happens to us, but it's what happens in the absence of an empathetic witness? Yeah.
Trauma is really the what's left behind in the wake of abuse or neglect, all the different things that happen to us, right? It could be going through, as I talk about in the book, a natural disaster. It could be a really painful betrayal in your life, whatever it is. What's left, that residual impact, is the trauma. And that looks different in each and every one of us because we're all, our bodies, our nervous systems have different ways of processing the overwhelm, the powerlessness, even the aloneness that we experience in these things. And so whenever we're talking about trauma, we're talking about that trifecta of overwhelm, of powerlessness, of aloneness, that unique cocktail in every one of us. And I think what ends up happening invariably with trauma is that as that overwhelm mounts, as that powerless mounts, we do isolate more and more, becoming disconnected from others, becoming disconnected from ourselves. And that's where we end up coping in the ways that we've talked about here, right? That's where we need someone in our lives, not least access to our own true selves, but we need that witness. We need someone to say, "Ah, wow, ouch, that hurt. That was hard. You were harmed. That wasn't fair. That shouldn't have happened." Right? For so many of us, I think who have experienced trauma, there is that sense that no one will ever understand, or I've got to go through life alone. I think every addiction is an attempt to do life on our own,
Mm,
right? And so, no surprise that in addiction recovery, there's it happens in the context of a relationship. Whether
yes.
that's at AA or you're paying someone $150 an hour, it happens in the context of a relationship. Why? Because we're made to be seen and known. It comes all the way back to safe, seen, soothe, and secure. Those four core needs. Um, I mean, you tell me, but I think most of us who are recovering addicts will say, I feel more alive now. I feel more connected now. I look back then and I thought it was helping, but really I felt powerless. I was isolated. I felt crappy all the time. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's why, listen, I've prayed for the Lord to take away, in a sense, the desire completely. But again, my desire isn't as much for alcohol as it is for escape. And you know what?
Yeah.
Guess what? The
Right.
Lord hasn't completely, like there's crap that happens that I'm like, would really love to just pull the ripcord here. Oh, and by the way, and to your point earlier, alcohol is an easy fix to that. It's an easy, quick
Mhm.
solution. I can
Mhm.
feel that
Yeah.
escape within, depending on how much I drink, within a few minutes, if you will.
Yeah.
But that hasn't happened. And so I think, yes, but yet I feel so much more connected, and having
Mhm.
to sit through it has forced me to find other healthy
Yeah.
mechanisms that bring me closer to those I love, my wife, my
Yeah.
kids, my family.
Yeah.
You said something there that I just want to ask about, which is this: how can it be? Because I've had family members who have said, and my name growing up, they called me Johnny. They said, Johnny, I went through the same thing, but I didn't go to drink that away, or I went through the same thing and it didn't affect me like that. And there's been some
Yeah.
confusion there. How do you explain to people, well, listen, two people can go through the same exact thing, and one
Yeah.
deals with this way and one deals with the other way?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's one way of explaining it is
Yeah.
just yeah, right, is to sort of name that reality that, that if you had support when you went through the stuff that you went through, if someone was able to bear witness, the reality is that chances are lower that you're going to need to self-medicate or cope in a particular way. But I think most of the time I turn around and I say, "How are you coping?" Because if it's not alcohol, what is it?
Mm.
And you've certainly on your own journey met people who are sort of self-righteous about like, I don't struggle with that. I mean, I've had plenty of people. I don't struggle with sex addiction. I don't struggle with alcohol. I mean, and what do you struggle with? How do you cope? That's the conversation that I want to have.
And I think that brings an important point, which is the church generally, well, if you're struggling with workaholism, that's fine, right?
Mm,
We
yeah,
if you're, as long as you're not a sex addict, as long as you're not an alcoholic, as long as you're not doing heroin.
yeah,
But if it's workaholism, that's
yeah,
better. That's fine.
yeah,
And I think, to your point, and what you said, and what we'll say is that's still an addiction. And
yeah,
by the way, to your story, it landed you in a Mexican hospital.
yeah. Right. That's right. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I was working with a pastor a number of years ago who, you know, we reflected on I do these 5-day intensives, so we reflected on day 1 versus day 5. Day 1, he came in, "Brother, I just want you to know, like, I'm not like some of the other pastors that you see, I'm not an alcoholic, I'm not a sex addict, I'm not a this, I'm not a that." And then at the end, of our time together, he said, "I never knew my drug was walking up those steps onto that stage with the lights on, and the Bible in my hand." Like, um, and uh, I mean, it was terrifying at some level because he knew he was going to have to step off that stage to make a recovery. Um, And in a way, he said, it feels to me like it'd be easier if it was alcohol now,
Yeah.
or it was sex addiction or something like that. I could sort of put that thing behind, but I've got to step away from the very thing that I've got complimented on since I was 2 or 3 years old, and I was on stage for my parents with a microphone in hand, and so it's an invitation to all of us to ask, how are we coping? I mean, if you're living in that story of that 1,185 chapters in the Bible, which we all are, how are you coping? Not if you're coping.
Two things. One, how familiar does that phrase that he says, well, at least I'm not. I mean, like, that's the story of the Pharisee, right? Like, at least I'm, God,
Yes.
thank you that I'm not like this,
Yeah.
this down and outer, right?
Yeah.
And then the second thing would be, and I want the church and Christian leaders to hear this, is like, I was the alcoholic. Chuck was the workaholic. Guess who ended up in the hospital? Well, it wasn't me. It was Chuck, right?
Yeah.
And
Sure.
yet, that's not to say that I'm better than you, right?
Yeah.
It's to say, like, look, all of our addictions, just because they manifest differently, they still drive us to the same place, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I want to end with this. You talk about, and this is a big theme of the book, coming home to yourself. Call it homing.
Oh yeah.
And so, you I want to read this. You say, homing is a part of the divine design. It's probably why so many of our favorite stories in Scripture are homecoming stories.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that process of coming home to yourself and homing?
Yeah, as I was writing, I happened to pick up a book. My wife loves birds, and she's gotten me into bird watching too. I picked up a book called The Homing Instinct, which is fascinating. Birds, certain kinds of birds, sandhill cranes, but sea turtles and sharks, and all these different creatures have homing beacons, right? These profound homing instincts. Like a sea turtle could be away from home for decades and find her way back to the same beach that she was born on and lay her eggs, right? And so there are these fascinating analogies in creation, right? But I think for us, there is that sense that our homing beacon is warped in some way, right? Like now it's innate, it's within us. And I think as I do the work, as I sit with people long enough for them to begin to relax their strategies of addiction and acquisition and all these different kinds of things, they begin to sense a deeper desire welling up. But for a lot of us, we're so dopamine addicted. We're like in the mall running from store to store to store to store that we lose touch with that innate homing instinct. And so part of the work is to notice the ways in which you're coping. For me, workaholism was just one of them, begin to lay them down, which I did in the years after that hospitalization, and begin to recognize a deeper desire welling up within for home, which is to say for connection, for deeper satisfaction, flourishing, wholeness, relationship, to be seen and known, all the things that we've been talking about since we've been here. And that's really, there's an aliveness that comes with that. Like what I found in people is like, that's where the real healing begins to happen, because they begin to long for that more than for the quick fix. And so, how does that homing happen? Oftentimes for us, for those of us who live in an addictive society and who are by nature, all of us addicts, it begins with us beginning to relax our coping mechanisms. And oftentimes that begins in very basic ways. As I'm working with folks, it's like, what if you turned off the radio or didn't listen to the podcast on your way to work? Well, I don't know. Like I'd have to just kind of be with myself. What's that like? I don't quite like it. That's
the
where
scariest part of it for me
begins, right? But what they find is that as they cultivate more and more connection within, there is this deepening desire, this deepening aliveness, this deepening sense of wonder and creativity. All these good things are birthed out of that reconnection that you were talking about.
The hardest part for me, really, in the aftermath of getting sober, was learning to sit with my thoughts. Because Alcohol allowed me not to. I didn't have to.
Yeah.
I didn't have to sit with that stuff. And there were times I'm literally just like pacing. I'm pacing the living room. I'm pacing the garage because I didn't know what to do. Right. And so it's such a great point. And I will say this, that homing, that aspect of wanting, especially as Christians, wanting to be with Jesus far more than you want the drink is, I wrote this article last year. It said, I was finally able to stop drinking by stopping trying to stop drinking. And because I had tried multiple times, been successful for a month or whatnot. But when it finally lasted was I shot for Jesus. When I shot for Jesus, and in a sense, when I came home, I got sobriety thrown in.
Yeah.
When I got that priority aligned, everything else, and I'm not going to say everything is always aligned, right, going forward, but in that sense, in that general sense, everything else kind of came aligned, and that's when I was able to stop drinking. That's when I was able to get sobriety. So I appreciate that so much. So the book is called Healing What's Within. I cannot recommend it enough. I have a resource guide on my website that has this as a recommended resource, especially for anyone dealing with addiction. Chuck, if people want to learn more about you, maybe if they want to try to get in one of those intensives you talked about, maybe they're a pastor that's listening to this and realizing, hey, I'm addicted to the pulpit. Where can they go? Yeah, so the website is chuckdegroat.net. And then I just Google me. I'm across the socials, addicted to perpetual presence on social media, because that's where we really fully come alive through our, avatar presence in social media. Yeah. But you can find me on variety spaces on social media. I'm not hard to get a hold of either. And I'm excited. You've taken to Substack. It's called Sit with Chuck. Yeah. And I'm a huge fan of Substack. And so I appreciate it. Chuck, thank you so much for sharing. Thanks, John. Yeah. Great to be with you. Excited for your book. Congratulations. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. One of the many things I loved about that conversation is that I think what Chuck made clear is it's not just like recovery. True recovery is not about behavior modification. And I think, and you guys have heard me talk about this, like I'm not anti 12 steps. I'm not trying to say that there's no place for any sort of recovery program. But I think so many times those become just about behavior modification. And so, what I say is if you need those, if you need an AA, if you need some of that, like go for it, right? But don't stop there. My ultimate goal for you is not sobriety. It's one of the goals, but it's not my ultimate goal. My ultimate goal for you is not sobriety. My ultimate goal for you is more of Jesus. Shoot for Jesus, get sobriety thrown in. And so I think what I hear in Chuck is that this is not just about recovery, is not just about behavior modification. It's about healing what's within, right? That's the title of his book, getting to those deeper issues. And I also like that Chuck is someone who has experienced a lot, right? As a pastor, as someone who broke down, right? Who was married to work and just reached the end of his rope. He realized he had to heal something. And so I think he's talking from a place that gets us, right? And so I really appreciate it. If you want to go deeper, you can again check out the book Healing What's Within from Chuck. It's really one of the most grounded, grace-filled guides that I've read on that intersection of psychology, faith, and recovery. And I'm so appreciative for what he's doing in his work and his practice. If there is one thing that you appreciated about this episode, would you please send it to someone? Not even going to like you, or I'm not even going to ask you to like, rate, subscribe, or share the whole episode, right? I mean, you can do those things. But if there's just 20 seconds of something that resonated with you or that you think will resonate with someone else, please send that to them, right? That's why I love doing this, is to help people. As always, visit our partner, Life Audio. LifeAudio.com makes this podcast possible. They've partnered with us. Love you all. We'll see you here next week.